So stash management, as with the past Diablo games, especially with how much loot has been dropping in Diablo 4, is undoubtedly an integral part of the game, even an extra layer of decision making if you will, which ultimately forces you to developing game knowledge to decide whether an item is actually worth keeping, and even ways that you can organize your stash space effectively. And so in today's quick video, I present to you 5 essential and easy tips that you can use to manage and definitely save stash space in Diablo 4. And with that, the very first tip I have for you is to filter out the best legendary aspect to save based on your goals and specializations that you'll be playing. So for example, if my goal right now is to focus on my druid and a specific type of druid being the tornado / lightning storm druid, I'll be saving the legendary aspects that'll be useful for that build and also the ones with the best rolls, especially as I progress into the higher levels and start collecting more of these same aspects. So the way I sort of progressed into it was, as I really honed in on these favorite builds of mine, I started filtering out the other druid aspects that are not going to be useful for me in the endgame, right? For example, all the werebear ones, I've sort of started not saving nearly as many of those legendary aspects, like for example, the ones that help pulverize. So I've only been saving the top rolls for those aspects in case, say, Blizzard does some balance changes and I happen to want to go back. I still save some of those, but compared to the main specs I've been playing, I've been proportionally saving a lot fewer of those legendary aspects that are not of my main spec and are only saving the best rolls for those, if any. And so as I kept gearing up and getting stronger and honing in on my storm build, I would then, whenever I would check my stash to do a bit of a cleanup, I would then progressively toss out and become more selective with not only my legendary aspects, of course keeping more of the ones that I might need and those with higher rolls, but also with the items themselves, the bases themselves, including legendary items which can also act as bases, right? So I would also start tossing out some of the lower item power bases, especially if their legendary aspect role was not very useful either. And not only that, but besides the class and specialization specific legendary aspects, which again, you want to keep the best roles for your own specialization while keeping the ones for sub-specs more toned down and limited. Anyhow, there are also other non-class specific legendary aspects, right, which are usable by any class. And so it would really benefit you to know which ones are actually useful and perhaps popular and used by a lot of specializations across all the classes. And let me actually list out a lot of the ones that are going to be useful for a lot of specializations on screen right now for your quick reference. But of course, some of these can be more niche depending on the specs, so it'd ultimately be really good if you not only knew which specializations and classes you're the most interested in playing, but also have an idea about the best items, not only the legendary aspects, but the attributes that you'll want on those items for those specializations and classes. But for sort of a general power tip that you can try to apply, and it's that offensive aspects are generally a lot more niche, and most builds will be using ones that are just specific to their own class anyway, or their own specialization anyway, meaning that the value of keeping generalist offensive aspects are not as beneficial as keeping some of the defensive and mobility ones, and even some of the resource ones, which are usually a lot more applicable and useful for a wide variety of specializations. And before we move on to tip number 2, I also want to quickly mention that to save inventory and stash space, you can also start filling up your aspects inventory, so to speak, right? Because it has its own designated inventory. So you can also use that as part of your storage for specifically aspects. Alright, and on to tip number 2. This definitely goes hand in hand with tip number 1, and that is to save only high item power, which is close to 800, assuming you're on world tier 4, bases, which includes both rares and legendaries. And here's the key part, with only good affixes, which if you're not really familiar with how damage and defenses work in Diablo 4, you might not have a very good idea about what affixes are actually really good compared to other ones, and which ones are almost useless. Now of course there can definitely be some nuance depending on the specialization that you're playing and what it actually specifically needs, but to sort of generalize for you, here are the offensive, defensive, and miscellaneous affixes that you generally cannot go wrong with. which are, by the way, also a lot better, significantly better than most of the other affixes that are available for that type. And in fact, these affixes I've listed here are usually so much more powerful than all the other ones that they're actually preferred by the vast majority of specializations. That is, of course, unless Blizzard makes a balance update, which could very well happen as well. And on to tip number 3, which is closely tied to tip number 2 regarding bases, and that is to reroll, also known as enchant, your potentially good bases, which for example are missing 1 or 2 good affixes, but could become really good after just a reroll. Which, if you do that early, you'll be able to potentially save a lot more space. For example, if you reroll an item too many times and it becomes too expensive without getting the affix you need, and if it's not a super, for example, high item power item anyway, you might just consider replacing it or tossing it out, right? Because the enchantment costs are not worth the reroll anymore. So with this strategy, instead of hoarding a bunch of potentially good bases in your stash, you might want to just take a bunch of them out first and then just try re-rolling each one. So that not only can you eliminate the ones that don't end up re-rolling very well and are not really high end anyway, but also if you do happen to land a really good item for that specific slot by re-rolling, you'll be able to then potentially just toss out all the other ones for that slot, right? Because you already got your best item or even just a really good item for that slot. Plus, if you like to play alts, saving gear for alts is generally grossly overrated as well. And the reason for that is, first of all, especially at a high level when you get gear to drop, they actually always come with level requirements too, which is actually the same level as your character's level that made that gear drop, right? So for example, if you're playing on a high level main and you get an item that you think you might not need on your main, but you might want to save for an alt, it'll actually have the same level requirement as your main at the level that you got it at. So by the time you play an alt, not only will you not be able to use it until much later on, but by then when your alt does say reach that level that your main was at earlier, that all probably would have found other pieces of gear that are comparable or even more suitable for them already. So I would say that unless you really know what you're specifically doing, to not generally have to worry too much about saving gear for your alts, unless it's like a super godly drop, right? With like the absolute highest rolls on the best affixes, or like a perfectly rolled legendary aspect that is also a useful one. Since each individual character in Diablo 4 is fairly self-sufficient, that's just the way the game is designed. So rather than saving up a bunch of gear that they might not be able to use until very later on, and that they might not even end up using anyway, I would rather save some additional stash space for the progression of that character, which I can sort of manage with replacing with upgrades and stuff like that with that individual character. But alas, if you really do have items that you really want to keep for whatever reason and definitely are running out of stash space, one sort of last resort, or I guess some people just do this more naturally, and that is to create mule characters to hold extra items in their inventory with, right? Because in Diablo 4 you get limited stash space, which is a shared stash with up to 4 tabs, at least as of right now. Later on with seasons and whatnot, there will definitely be additional stash tabs that we'll get. But for now, with 4 stash tabs shared across all your characters, some people actually like to make so-called mule characters for the specific purpose of holding extra items in their inventory, right? And to the point that some people even name specific characters for the item type that they hold, right? Such as one that has general legendary aspects usable by any class, another with class specific legendary aspects, and so on and so forth. And with that, that is all I wanted to share with you today regarding stash management and expansion tips. Let me know what other tips you might have in the comment section below, and I'll definitely answer your comments. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Consider subscribing for more cutting edge guides, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.